Hey guys, it's Ellie. Welcome back to Bite-Sized Book of Mormon. I'm glad to have you with me. So if you've never been here before, this is just a podcast where I read through one chapter of the Book of Mormon each episode, and to give a little bit of context, a little bit of insight, a little bit of good times, so stick around. So if you remember last episode, we read Alma chapter 27, in which the Anti-Nephi-Lehi's, newly known as the Ammonites, are settled in the Nephite land of Jershon. So they officially ally themselves with the Nephites, they come live in their lands, and the Nephites defend them with their troops. This is after the Lamanites came back after fighting the Nephites and started attacking the Anti-Nephi-Lehi's again after the initial attack, which happened a few chapters ago. So anyways, they are now safe and protected from Lamanite attacks among the Nephites, and they're homies now. So yeah, if you haven't listened to that already, go back and listen to the episode. It's a good one. And yeah, I think without further ado, let's read Alma chapter 28. And now it came to pass that after the people of Ammon were established in the land of Jershon, and a church also established in the land of Jershon, and the armies of the Nephites were set round about the land of Jershon, yea, in all the borders round about the land of Zarahemla, behold, the armies of the Lamanites had followed their brethren into the wilderness. And thus there was a tremendous battle, yea, even such an one as never had been known among all the people in the land from the time Lehi left Jerusalem, yea, and tens of thousands of the Lamanites were slain and scattered abroad. Yea, and also there was a tremendous slaughter among the people of Nephi. Nevertheless, the Lamanites were driven and scattered, and the people of Nephi returned again to their land. And now this was a time that there was a great mourning and lamentation heard throughout all the land, among all the people of Nephi. Yea, the cry of widows mourning for their husbands, and also of fathers mourning for their sons, and the daughter for the brother, yea, the brother for the father, and thus the cry of mourning was heard among all of them, mourning for their kindred who had been slain. And now surely this was a sorrowful day, yea, a time of solemnity, and a time of much fasting and prayer. This is wild. I feel like people kind of overlook this because it's said in so few words, but tens of thousands of Lamanites were killed. And on the Nephite side, it says that in verse 3, there was a tremendous slaughter. The Lamanites came to attack the Anti-Nephi-Lehi's after they allied themselves with the Nephites, and the Nephite army was slaughtered, and tens of thousands of Lamanites were killed and scattered. This is a momentous battle, and since it's said in so few words, I feel like it's underappreciated when we think about the story of the Book of Mormon. The fact that the Nephites were willing to sacrifice their sons and husbands and fathers to protect the Anti-Nephi-Lehi's, who were until very recently the very same Lamanites that are attacking them, that's crazy. And they don't retreat, even though they're not really protecting themselves, they're protecting, again, the Ammonites that will not defend themselves. But they're keeping their promise that they will defend the Anti-Nephi-Lehi's to death. Like literally until they die, they will defend them. And that is why so many Nephites died. And as it says in verse 5, the cry of mourning was heard among all of them, mourning for their kindred who had been slain. Everyone was mourning. Everyone had someone close to them who died. This is not just like, oh yeah, we lost a couple dozen people in a little skirmish. It's like, no, everyone is touched by this tragedy. This is a huge thing that is rocking the Nephite civilization. And yet, as it says in verse 6, it was a time of much fasting and prayer. When faced with massive amounts of grief and pain, they turned to fasting and prayer instead of anger and resentment. That is faith. And it's taken for granted in these verses that, yeah, of course they turned to fasting and prayer, but would you? If suddenly everyone you knew and loved was killed in a battle, would you so easily turn to prayer instead of immediate anger at God for allowing this to happen? I'm not saying any of us would do that, but I'm saying that it's harder than this verse gives it credit for people just to turn to prayer so easily. Massive props to the Nephites and the Ammonites who lost people that they loved and still prayed to God and still had that faith to fast and seek for answers. Because again, fasting, at least in our modern church, is understood as kind of like an amplified form of prayer, like showing God that you're really, really intent on this prayer. And so, again, people were fasting, and in my opinion, it was because they were looking for answers. They were looking for why this happened. They were looking for assurances on what happened to their family and friends. And they turned, again, to fasting instead of questioning God himself. They're faithfully questioning him, rather, with fasting, as opposed to just angrily questioning him, and therefore rejecting the gospel because of this great tragedy. Tragedy is definitely a turning point when it comes to someone's faith, because it can either push you away or pull you closer, and it is up to you. And as I've mentioned many times on this podcast, it is in times of crisis that where we turn matters most. One of the measures of how we're doing this life is where we turn when we have nowhere else to go. Do we turn to the world looking for validation, or do we turn to God to find truth and assurance and love? And thus ended the 15th year of the reign of the judges over the people of Nephi. And this is the account of Ammon and his brethren, their journeyings in the land of Nephi, their sufferings in the land, their sorrows and their afflictions, and their incomprehensible joy, and the reception and safety of the brethren in the land of Jershon. And now may the Lord, the Redeemer of all men, bless their souls forever. And this is the account of the wars and contentions among the Nephites, and also the wars between the Nephites and the Lamanites, and the 15th year of the reign of the judges is ended. And from the 1st year to the 15th has brought to pass the destruction of many thousand lives, yea, it has brought to pass an awful scene of bloodshed. And the bodies of many thousands are laid low in the earth, while the bodies of many thousands are mouldering in heaps upon the face of the earth, yea, and many thousands are mourning for the loss of their kindred, because they have reason to fear, according to the promises of the Lord, that they are consigned to a state of endless woe. So these last few verses are kind of like looking back on the first 15 years of the reign of the judges. And as it says in verse 10, the first 15 years brought to pass the destruction of many thousand lives. So again, it's kind of looking back and reflecting. But what I love is in verse 8, it kind of sums up like, this is the account of Ammon and his brethren and their journeyings, whatever. But what I love about it is where it says, their sorrows and their afflictions and their incomprehensible joy. I have that underlined with a note saying, such is life. Because in the very same breath in this verse, it talks about sorrows and afflictions, and then, without even missing a beat, incomprehensible joy. And the wording on this, to me, weighs the joy with more powerful language than it does the sorrows and afflictions. Because there's no intensifying adjectives added to sorrow or afflictions. It's just called sorrows and afflictions. But when it talks about joy, it adds one of the most intensifying adjectives there is, incomprehensible. You can't even imagine how good their joy is, despite everything they're going through. In fact, maybe even because of everything they're going through. In fact, there is opposition in all things, as Lehi teaches in 2 Nephi 2, and actually, it is the depth of sadness that makes us appreciate the heights of joy. There is a Mormon message, that's what they used to be called at least, that I love very much called The Refiner's Fire. I'm sure that you've seen it. It's a very famous one. And it talks about the life story of this person who lost basically her entire family to different forms of cancer. She has suffered extreme amounts of tragedy in her life, but the video ends with her testimony. And it talks about the concept that the worse sorrow that you go through, the more meaning and depth and dimension is given to your joy. And so, when I struggle personally with things, I come at it with the perspective that like, wow, this really sucks. But going forward, I will appreciate whatever joy and peace and happiness I find that much more. And that's what this phrase in verse 8 is telling me, that they weigh their sorrows and afflictions as light compared to their incomprehensible joy, which has so much more weight to them. And again, I love how it's described in the same breath, like sorrows, afflictions, and joy. Because as I wrote in my note years ago, such is life. And this chapter is filled to the brim with grief and mourning and tragedy, but it also talks about joy and prayer and finding God in the suffering, which is beautiful. While many thousands of others truly mourn for the loss of their kindred, yet they rejoice and exult in the hope, and even know, according to the promises of the Lord, that they are raised to dwell at the right hand of God in a state of never-ending happiness. And thus we see how great the inequality of man is because of sin and transgression, and the power of the devil which comes by the cunning plans which he hath devised to ensnare the hearts of men. And thus we see the great call of diligence of men to labor in the vineyards of the Lord. And thus we see the great reason of sorrow and also of rejoicing. Sorrow because of death and destruction among men, and joy because of the light of Christ unto life. All of the stuff that I've been talking about the balance of opposition in all things, of the good and the bad, and how the worse the bad, the better the good, that is summed up perfectly in kind of Mormon's little postscript here that he adds to the chapter in the last two verses. Especially the last phrase of verse 14, the very last phrase of the chapter says, sorrow because of death and destruction among men, and joy because of the light of Christ unto life. That is life. There is a lot of pain and suffering and struggle, but there is incomprehensible joy that comes from the peace and happiness and love of God. And that contradiction is where I find the most beauty in the world. Yes, life sucks for a lot of people, and it sucks for me sometimes too, but we all have the light of Christ, and there is truth to be found. There is peace and love in the gospel, and that's beautiful. And also what I want to talk about is how in verse 13 it kind of describes how the inequality of man, as it says, quote, is because of sin and transgression and the power of the devil. And so I kind of want to mention this because a lot of the problems that people have with religion when they don't understand it, at least not our LDS theology, is that God must have created evil in some way. If God created the world and he created us, how could he have not created evil as well? But this clarifies that the inequality of man, which is where most of the unjustness and cruelty of the world comes from, is because of sin and transgression and the power of the devil. God allows us to have agency which we can use to sin and transgress. We can use to yield to the temptations of the devil. And it is because of the fact that God gives us agency that evil exists, because we are allowed to use it for bad, just as we are allowed to use it for good. Again, this is massively inspiring to me because God cares about agency almost above all else. He will suffer us doing horrible, awful, cruel things to each other if it means that we have agency, if it means that we have the liberty to choose, even if that means that the world is a cruel and awful place sometimes. Anyways, that is the chapter. My gosh, what a good chapter. It's so short, it's only 14 verses, and I feel like it kind of flies under the radar. But the whole theme of this chapter is joy in the face of unending sorrow, and joy in Christ despite the vast mourning and tragedies of man. Tens of thousands of Nephites potentially died, and yet the people find joy. Not all is lost, and that is beautiful to me. And so the stand-up verse for this chapter, not too surprising, is going to be verse 14, which says, "And thus we see the great call of diligence of men to labor in the vineyards of the Lord, and thus we see the great reason of sorrow and also of rejoicing, sorrow because of death and destruction among men, and joy because of the light of Christ unto life." I've already kind of talked about why this verse is so good, but also I want to mention how it's not invalidating the sorrow that we feel. It is acknowledging that there is sorrow in the world and that we feel much of it because, again, the death and destruction among men, but it also talks about the joy because of the light of Christ unto life. So it doesn't show that we are less good disciples of Christ when we feel sorrow and when we mourn. That doesn't mean that we don't understand Christ. That just means that we are human, that we feel emotions. And just because we understand the principle of eternal life doesn't mean that we can't mourn. But also, we have access to this wonderful, incomprehensible joy through the light of Christ that maybe not that many people in this world have access to. This chapter is full of awful evil and wonderful good, and I want you to experience and find both. There is beauty in suffering, there's beauty in joy, there's beauty all around, one might say. And this is a wonderfully poetic chapter, and I hope you appreciate it as much as I do. So yeah, that is the episode for today. My gosh, I really enjoyed this one a lot more than I thought I would, and I hope you did too. Anyways, there's just a few links down in the show notes that I want to mention. The first one is you let me know your learned links. If you're going to shoot me a message, you can click that link, or you can just DM me on Instagram, either way. There's also some links to access a digital version of the Book of Mormon, so if you want to click those and find your own copy so you can read along or create your own study plan or what have you, go ahead and do that. Next, there's a quick support the show link, so if you want to shoot me a few dollars and support what I do, that would be wonderfully appreciated. Next, we are on YouTube, so if you want to go subscribe to the YouTube channel, you can find the podcast twice a week, you can find some YouTube shorts that I'm going to be uploading soon, and you can also find some trivia polls. I like to think that they're at least somewhat difficult, so go try your luck, I guess. And finally, we are on Instagram, so go follow me on Instagram, the very bottom link in the show notes, if you want to find episode clips, stand-up verses, Book of Mormon themed reels that are both funny and stupid and perfect, and also, as on YouTube, trivia. So anyways, I hope to see you there, and yeah, I'll talk to you later. Bye.